And but now what we're going to talk about is the things that hopefully enable a lot of innovation in the industry. And that has to do with space law. It's with all the commercial introductions into the industry, this is a very important topic, critical to a lot of players, a lot of the new players coming into the industry. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for this session, Francesca Schroeder. Francesca is the managing member of Schroeder Law, PLLC, a Washington, D.C. firm that focuses on space and national security law. Clients turn to Ms. Schroeder for help with complex issues involving licensing and regulation of spacecraft and launch projects, compliance with U.S. export controls and economic sanctions, drafting and negotiating commercial and government contracts, liability and risk management, and legislative and policy matters. She has served as private sector advisor to the U.S. delegation to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and on the NASA Advisory Council's Commercial Space Committee. Francesca is also an adjunct professor at the University of Nebraska School of Law, where she co-teaches a course on space and satellite business law. She also happens to be the legal counsel for the American Astronautical Society, so we enjoy that very much. So with that, I turn it over to you. Welcome, Francesca.
Hey, Jim. Thanks. You. Is this on? Yes. Everybody can hear me? Okay, good. Hi, everybody. Jim, do we want to wait for a minute for people to come in?
No, go ahead.
Okay, we can get started. I'll just chat for a minute. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. This is my first time speaking at the NASA Glenn Symposium. I'm delighted to be doing that. As Jim mentioned, I'm legal counsel to the AAS. It's a labor of love. It's something I've been doing for shockingly decades, and it is an absolute joy to see the growth of the industry, the growth of the community. AAS, I'll just plug AAS for a minute, not that it needs it, but it's an amazing professional society. We're not a big organization, but we are mighty. We put together amazing programs like this symposium, and you can obviously look on the website for all the other programs that we do. And it's just, in my opinion, a fantastic way of providing a platform for the community, for the whole space community, whether it's your interest is academic or civil space or commercial space or military space, a really wonderful forum for networking and for having, intimate discussions about cutting edge topics that affect your career and affect where the industry is going next. So again, thank you very much for participating in an AAS event. So without further ado, let's get started. We have a lot to cover today. So we're going to talk about space law, and people often ask me, what is that? And I mean, this crowd knows what it is. I don't have to make the comment of it. It has nothing to do with real estate. It has nothing to do with office space. It is like the cool space. And people often ask, well, like, how does that, what happens if something goes wrong in space? Well, that's a really good question. And there are laws and regulations to govern that activity. But as you can imagine, they are complex and they vary, whether the activity is launch or reentry or on orbit. I mean, those are all different opportunities for risk and for legal issues to arise. So practitioners in the field try to figure out ways to address those eventualities. And they affect, like I said, they affect different elements of space activities in different ways, and they affect your role in different ways. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're a startup company, you'll be faced with certain legal issues that might not be challenging for a huge, seasoned, giant aerospace and defense contractor, but the issues are very real for you, and you have to manage them in order to execute your business plan the way you want to. And even if you are an extremely experienced aerospace company, you have the same issues, you just might handle them differently. And you might manage the risks differently, and you might respond to the legal issues differently. So what I try to do today is organize a panel with my friends, which I'm very, very lucky to have been in the industry so long. I've got friends in all different disciplines, to talk to you about those issues facing entrepreneurs, issues facing companies that are up and running, and how to manage those risks, like what happens when you have a bad day. So to start off, I would like to invite Michael Chodas to present his slides and his remarks. Michael is an entrepreneur himself, also an attorney and an advisor to chief executives in a variety of high technology fields. But I particularly wanted Michael to join us today because he formerly was the Associate Administrator for Entrepreneurial Development at the U.S. Small Business Administration, where he also had served as Deputy General Counsel. So I thought Michael could give us a great overview of those issues that challenge entrepreneurs. So with that, Michael, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Francesca. Let's see. There's probably some, there we go. Okay, there we go. Sorry, it apparently takes a minute to catch up. Anyway, throughout the conference, there's going to be, and I can already tell from the discussion that we had just a moment ago, there's going to be kind of a diversity of discussion, very, very big picture discussion about what the future holds for the space industry in general, and some very granular discussion about tactics and strategies that folks can use to address particular issues that come up. So there's going to be kind of a bit of all of that. And I know that in this particular room, we also have a diversity of folks ranging from government representatives, entrepreneurs, representatives of the very largest prime contractors in this space, and others from within industry. So I don't propose to talk about entrepreneurship sort of tools and tactics in a specific way. I think that's a different discussion that we can have in some kind of a breakout. But I wanted to talk about entrepreneurship as a key feature of the economic development transformation that's underway in the industry. So the world as we have all known it in space for many, many, many years is changing. No one in this room is not aware of that. Everyone's aware of that. But the nature of these changes, like most tectonic changes, are sometimes kind of hard to see in the moment. And there's some value from time to time to sort of pull ourselves up to a higher altitude, if I can use the pun, and look at them from a somewhat different perspective. So I wanted to talk about entrepreneurship in that context. And I frame it like this. As we were discussing with the panel just 5 minutes ago, Ohio, this part of the country, the US in general, is blessed with a wealth of innovation, technological expertise, drive, willingness, all of the above. And yet, all of us from time to time confront the question of why is it that one particular technology or technologist seems to make a successful business when another technology or technologist, which seems to be of equal value, fails? What's that about? And what does it say for a future in which we have to compete not just with the rest of the country, but with the rest of the world? And how do we think about entrepreneurship and success in a much more effective way, given that we start with the smarts and the drive, and it's just a question of getting the help, the community, and the support needed to have many, many, many more of these ventures succeed in the future. So with that, if you hear about entrepreneurship, what's the first image that comes to your mind? You know, we are surrounded by robotics advancements here at Case Western, by advancements in biopharma technology generally. But when you think about entrepreneurship, you don't think about that. As a general rule, you think about someone who is starting small, building upon what already exists out there in the world with a dream, some technology, and a whole bunch of gumption. That's what entrepreneurship actually is. It is that in publications, it's that in communication, it's that in entertainment, and it's that in space. It doesn't matter that it's in space. It's the same thing. And yet, space is an industry, like industries that we've seen before in this country, but it is an industry in which massive amounts of money are already being deployed in the service of innovation, but in which entrepreneurship is just getting started. So space has been involved with business and commerce for decades. There's nothing new about business and commerce in space, but the nature of business and commerce and its relationship with government has been a certain way. Government has been the gatekeeper, government has been the enabler, government has been the accumulator and spender of funds. There's nothing wrong with this. It has gotten us to where we are now, and it's going to continue to be true for some period of time going into the future. But that is changing. We are now in an era where when you hear the term entrepreneur, in a context of space, what you often think of is Jeff Bezos, you might think of Elon Musk, you might think of others who have been phenomenally successful in deploying their smarts and their capital in the service of privatizing infrastructure. This has happened before. We used to have government control of transportation. We had those who had the resources and the smarts to be able to create a railroad system, then a highway system, more recently a information superhighway system, all of which became essentially commoditized infrastructure once it was privatized. That transition is underway right now. And what that means is massive amounts of capital are being deployed right now to decide who is going to provide the highway back and forth into space and the infrastructure that makes that highway work. When that infrastructure is commoditized, we're going to be in the era of the entrepreneur in space. You are seeing the very beginning of it at the moment. It is something that all of you will see over the coming several decades. And what it will basically mean is that once the space entrepreneurship, essentially sector, truly begins to develop, there won't be individual little tiny examples of space entrepreneurship. There will be the same explosion of entrepreneurship that you have seen in communications, in software development generally, in transport, in every other thing that we're seeing happen around the country, and it's going to be happening in space. And the reason it's going to be happening is that there will be a cheap set of transport and platforms on which to build. But until those exist, it's going to be nascent. So what does that look like? The ecosystem of space that we see today right now through the lens of entrepreneurship is familiar. It includes, obviously, launch entrepreneurship at the core of it. It includes all of the things that happen on space platforms, satellite technology, software, et cetera. It includes the host of services that go into providing all of that. It includes this vast group of folks who act as the supply chain for the existing privatization of the infrastructure going back and forth into space. But this list now, even though it is massive, is tiny compared to what this is going to look like in the future. And if you want to know what the future is going to look like, there are folks in Ohio and beyond who are sitting either in garages or labs as we speak, developing the next set of boxes that are going to go on this slide. They may be in tourism, they may be in entertainment, they may be in biopharma, but they are all going to leverage the commoditized infrastructure of space once it's developed. But let's be clear about where we are today. It's important to understand when we're looking over the horizon and when we're looking next door. So in 2012, $300 million was spent in private investment in space ventures. If you look over on the right and you see how much the US invests, both in the form of debt and equity investments every year, it's 14 trillion. So that's every year. What that means is the body of economic activity in the US is massive, and space is just starting to play its role in that entrepreneurial field. If you look more recently, in 2021, the amount of public and private money invested in space, not counting money that the very largest space entrepreneurs have obtained for themselves, it's about 10 billion. Other people count it a little bit differently. Even that is only 1/40th of the red piece of that pie. So this is an area with infinite opportunity for growth. So with that backdrop, entrepreneurship is going to define what the future of space looks like once infrastructure is finished. And that is not going to happen this week, this month, this year, or even next year. But as soon as as soon as the launch infrastructure is commoditized, that yellow and especially that red slice of that pie are going to begin to move to all of the entrepreneurial activities you're familiar with based in space development. So, coming down from the 350-mile low Earth orbit altitude for a minute and getting a little bit more specific, when we ask why is it that some ventures succeed And why is it that some ventures fail? Even though, in theory, everybody is incredibly smart, capable, and committed when they start an entrepreneurial venture, it has to do, among many other things, with these sort of fundamentals of business enterprise. So obviously, when you start a space venture, you are starting a venture which begins with a piece of technology, but which has to build an entire business foundation underneath that technology in order to succeed. No man or woman is an island, and no entrepreneur ever succeeds alone. So all of these things fundamentally fall into the category of making the connections, building the partnerships, and engaging in the analysis, benchmarking, and community enterprise that forms any business. So let's talk about just a couple of these very quickly. When you're developing a cool robotic application for space, and you go to somebody to invest in it, the first thing they ask about is, how many of these can we sell? And are we going to sell any of these, or is this a prototype, or is this something that can ultimately be developed and used again and again and again on a production basis? What is the ultimate market for this kind of a thing before we invest any money in it? Next, and there are many, many, many things to look at, we don't have time, but next they will say, who's the team? I'm fond of saying every entrepreneur, and I have dealt with thousands and thousands and thousands of entrepreneurs, every entrepreneur has a superpower. Whatever it is. It may be financial analysis, it may be a technical skill or area of expertise, it might be people skills, marketing, sales, but they all have one, and they all lack everything else. That's not a criticism, it's just the way it is. And so the entrepreneurs who succeed are the ones who surround themselves with a team that can bring all the rest of those areas of expertise to bear. So if you don't know a thing about financial statements and your eyes go blurry when you look at them, but you can develop the most advanced robotics in the state of Ohio, it's not a problem. It just means that you need to partner up with somebody who can provide that area of expertise. And then probably most significant for the folks in this room, intellectual property is often spoken about and very rarely discussed in terms of enforcement. So it is easy to create intellectual property. It is easy to protect intellectual property. It is often very difficult to enforce those protections of intellectual property. That is true in our current environment when we exploit things in the US. It's even more complicated when you are exploiting your IP in space. And that's going to be even more complicated when the regulation in space becomes more internationalized and less nationalized. We'll discuss that. That will happen over time. Next, we're going to be talking a lot about the very specific current approach to risk in space ventures. But when somebody is thinking of investing in an entrepreneurial investment in space, they think much more broadly about risk, both current and future. What are the risks that you currently face when you're getting ready to do a venture in space? And what are the risks that you will face 5 years from now and 10 years from now? And I think what's critical to understand is, if you go to an investor and say, I have an extremely effective technology and I can sell it to one customer through the federal procurement process, that is an unattractive investment scenario, because it's a tiny, limited market with enormous bureaucratic and other obstacles. But if you say, I can go through one particular channel to get early stage capital, to get my proof of concept in place, and then I have a clear path to a commercial exploitation of what I'm going to do, suddenly you have a conversation that investors are going to back. And that is what we see happening in all of those economic development activities you were hearing about in the last session. That is what is currently underway in Ohio and beyond, especially around space. So here, what I think is most important to sort of focus upon is that, as everyone in this panel will discuss, space currently feels like it is extremely highly regulated. Mm-hmm. It is nothing compared to the regulation that is going to be applicable to ventures that are entrepreneurial ventures that are exploiting opportunities in space in the future. Right now, there are a number of US-based regulatory regimes that are critical for an entrepreneur to understand and to comply with. Ultimately, they're going to be US, EU, British, international, treaty-based, and other nation-state and international regimes for regulation that are going to have to be navigated and complied with. That is both an obstacle and it is also an opportunity for those who are effective at doing that and who surround themselves with the kind of help that's needed to navigate that sort of thing. Just to give you an example, everyone in this room may have heard that Microsoft is currently dealing with the US government on antitrust interest in its acquisition of Activision, which is a maker of online computer games. No one, and by the way, it's currently being blocked by the British regulator who is looking at the effect on competition in the computer game industry of that potential acquisition. Nobody at Microsoft 10 years ago ever thought that competition in the online gaming industry would become a fundamental blocker to their development in business. It didn't seem that antitrust was even on the radar screen. It's a sort of a preview of coming attractions to what's going to be happening in entrepreneurship in space. Once again, that is not something to be upset about. It's simply something to be aware of and to navigate through. So, next, finally, and I want to turn it over to everybody after this, but as part of this framing, I wanted to say, for those in the room who are entrepreneurs, let's do a quick show of hands. How many folks in the room are entrepreneurs who are pursuing business ventures of one sort or another, or who are thinking of pursuing business ventures of one sort or another? So we have just a few. Professor, we have a few others who are doing that. Here's the critical point. If an investor ever knows more about the risks and issues facing your sector than you do, you are not going to be successful in getting investment into your operation or into your venture. You need to understand each of the different dimensions of the risk that you face so that you can master them, understand them, have a plan for addressing them, and then move past them. So fundamentally, what an entrepreneur is going to need to do in the coming few years is essentially learn as this industry develops and moves from its current sort of structure and pattern into a much more thousand-flower blooming entrepreneurial sector, what all of these different regulatory issues are, what the groups are with whom they can affiliate in order to address them, what the strategies are for getting help from SBA, from the Department of Commerce, from state and local economic development agencies, from all of the accelerators here and beyond in order to be able to plan to get past these and then to take action and measure their success. So essentially what I'm saying is if you are an entrepreneur and going into a space venture, start with your technology and recognize that it is the first of a host of wheels that need to go under the cart in order to be successful. Do not plan to make that journey on your own. Connect up with the other folks who can help and with the many resources that are available at the state and local level, and success will ultimately result in a massive increase in the amount of capital flowing into this sector. I know we were talking this morning about capital flows today. When we look back at this 10 years from now, it's going to be many, many, many multiples of that, and the entrepreneurs are going to be the ones who are generating the excitement causing that to happen. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. That was really important and interesting, and really, really important topic for the group. And honestly, a topic that AAS often doesn't cover. We often don't talk about entrepreneurship and the way you've delivered these messages. So I thank you for that. Now I'd like to introduce Kristen Price. Kristen is Chief Counsel of Blue Origin. Kristen, I've got a whole bunch of questions for you. I know you and I have discussed them in the past, but just for benefit of the audience, I just want to kind of put a little bit of some framework around the issues. So we want to talk about, what are the major legal issues or challenges facing a commercial space company today that is up and running and robust and has a lot of different irons in the fire? Do companies like yours need statutory or regulatory amendments in order to execute your business plan effectively and efficiently? Can a company manage these risks contractually? Do they need to be managed in a different way? Does the answer to that question require guidance from the U.S. government? Can you limit that guidance? Do you want to limit that guidance? Do you want to increase that guidance?
Yeah.
I turn it over to you.
Yeah. I'm going to back up just a little bit and kind of jump off of some stuff that Michael spoke about. Sure. First of all, super grateful to be here. I think engagement across functions and in the industry is incredibly important. I'm lucky to be at Blue. The vision of Blue is millions of people living and working in space for the benefit of Earth. And so it's lost on no one at Blue that Blue isn't going to do that on its own. As you talked about, this is not something that you're gonna tackle independently. And so a lot of what you said resonated a lot. We need a diverse and sustainable industry to be built in order to work towards this vision. The scope of programs that Blue has is incredibly broad. I'll give a quick overview of those in about 30 seconds. And diversity of customers and applications makes Blue stronger for sure, but I'd go as far to say most any company, to understand the different facets that each customer base kind of brings. Yeah. How long do I gotta wait after pushing the button?
Did he hold up?
There we go. All right, so from left to right, we've got astronaut Powers there aboard New Shepard. She flew October of 2021 on our second human space flight. Then we've got, that's our suborbital launch system. New Glenn orbital launch system model there in the center, weight simulator. Then Blue Moon lunar lander, square in the middle, was just fortunate enough to receive a NASA award for sustaining lunar development, so super excited about that. Blue Engines, it's the next over. That's a BE4, but we've also got BE3U, BE3PM. BE4 is going to power both the Vulcan launch system and the New Glenn launch system, so that's super exciting to have both ULA being enabled there and Blue Zone system. And then farthest on the right is Orbital Reef, which is our concept for something that could exist in the future. But yeah, all those things, Francesca, all those things you said. No, I think there's a lot of opportunity for Blue to be influential and an enabler as opposed to only an actor. The goal really is building this road to space so that then entrepreneurs and small businesses can start to figure out how to best utilize that space. There's a lot of challenges, not the smallest of which is trying to figure out how risk gets mitigated. One of the tools to mitigate risk historically and in well-established industries and also in space has been our friends in the insurance industry. But there's challenges. There's challenges in availability and just what the right allocations are. The risk allocations are managed somewhat effectively contractually, but generally behind every contract is some sort of insurance policy program that really protects the interests of the business and the investors in the business. So my co-panelist here has a lot more experience on this topic than me. I think that's I have one more try? No, maybe that's it. Do you want me to kick it over to you?
Sure. I'm here to speak about the insurance part of, boring, right? Maybe if you're reading your personal insurance policy for your home. But I have to say that I work in space liability insurance, and it's one of the most exciting. Oh, okay. It's one of the most exciting insurance places to be. I've gotten to do amazing things. I get to go to rocket launches. I get to go to manufacturing plants. I get to stand on the gantryways before where you go for a rocket. And if you take tons of insurance underwriters there, and we're standing up there on top of and they're looking at the rocket and whatnot, and all of a sudden the only thing they're interested in is the alligator that's like walking around. You're like, what are you doing? So back to the insurance part. So now, right here I have a slide, and one of the things that the entrepreneur probably doesn't think about is you probably do need to buy some insurance at some point in time. And what I have up here is the risk phases of a commercial mission. And so I don't know how familiar everyone is, but Michael alluded to the fact that there's different U.S. liability regimes out there. There's CSLA, which is the Commercial Space Launch Act. There's also NASA Act. And then there's also a thing called Public Law 85804. During a commercial mission, which is something like that Blue Origin would do, or SpaceX, there's right here, there's different phases. So you have the assembly and integration and testing. That could be under NASA. Oh, I guess I'm missing some of my slide here. So you can't see all my little, there you go. So the different arrows there sort of point to the fact that within the entire phase of the mission, there could be different liability regimes that are applicable that will set excess over any insurance limits. There could be different cross waivers that are applicable. So it's very important to engage early with an insurance broker that understands what's going on in the different liability regimes, as well as in the different risk phases, and to speak to someone about it, and to make sure that your contract that you put in place, insurance will follow what the contract language says. So it's very important that you understand what your contract says so that you have the right insurance in place.
Well, and let me just add that the requirements actually for space exist in statute. So it's not like you're just thinking one day, oh, I wonder if I need insurance. Actually, the U.S. government will tell you that you do, because even though Michael says we're not that regulated, and you're probably right, I know in the scheme of things, because no, we haven't really thought about how a foreign country might block what we're trying to do in the U.S. That's a good point that Microsoft apparently has just discovered. But we do have plenty of regulation, and a very important element of that is how you manage risk. And one of the reasons why that exists is because the U.S. government has to make sure that the uninvolved public, that innocent third parties, if they are injured or harmed or lose property as a result of a licensed space activity, there needs to be a mechanism in place to make those, that innocent, uninvolved public whole again. And the most convenient and effective way to do that is to make sure that there is financial responsibility in place to make that happen. And the most streamlined way and assured way of making that happen is to, in fact, require the procurement of third-party liability insurance, of which Amy is an expert in placing, or in talking to underwriters about placing. And the way that gets communicated throughout a project is not only through the licenses that the U.S. government will issue, but also through contracts. And Kristen, if I can, throw this back at you for a minute. What about the contractual management of these legal issues? So can you just talk a little bit about how a negotiation on that point might happen, and what challenges that you might face when somebody doesn't really understand what it means that they have to waive claims, or that you're going to somehow add them as an additional insured on your insurance policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can we go back to Amy's chart? Because I think on that question, we're coming to a place where up through the launch campaign and even the launch, I think is getting more and more settled and decently understood. But everything to the right of that, I would say, I guess reentry is getting more common too, but most of the stuff to the right is quite a bit more squishy. And it's a lot different depending on whether you're interacting with a commercial firm or a government entity. There's certain waivers that apply for work on the ISS. It's on that chart. There is very little in the space of interactions in space between commercial actors, even for NASA or on behalf of the government customer. So that's harder to manage contractually, because essentially it's just the meeting of the minds between those two parties, and it's not there's no kind of guardrails in place. So I think in that space is where I'm interested in being part of the discussion to figure out how we work towards kind of establishing some guardrails, and also just general awareness for entrepreneurs, for the industry in general, because negotiations with suppliers and others are sometimes difficult when you've got the task of negotiating itself, but you've also got the task of trying to work through collaboratively what the statutory and risk regimes actually even say and create. Like, you have to come to an agreement on the company's interpretations of those regimes. And Francesca and I have worked on making that possible, and it, even for very sophisticated teams, it can be a real challenge.
Yeah, and as a legal matter, the law is quite well established with respect to launch and reentry, but there's a question mark that's currently being debated all over in Congress, in the executive branch, within industry, within academia, about the degree of regulation of on-orbit activity, and how might that activity be licensed and regulated and supervised. These are obligations that exist by virtue of the United States being a party to the international space treaties, in particular the Outer Space Treaty and the Liability Convention, where as a state's party to that treaty, as a signatory to that treaty, the U.S. assumes certain obligations, and those obligations are flowed down to individual actors, whether they be entrepreneurs or whether they be established companies. It doesn't matter if you're a U.S. entity engaged in a space activity, you expose the U.S. government to liability, theoretically. And the way the U.S. government manages that liability is through the implementation of domestic law and regulation. Included in that are these risk management regimes that we're discussing. So it'll be interesting to see how the licensing and regulation evolves and develops with respect to this on-orbit activity, lunar activity, et cetera. So that's going to be very interesting. And yeah, very happy to have a front row seat to that. Amy, can I ask you a question about sort of the availability of insurance and how?
I was actually just going to interject.
Okay, great.
That is one of the
Yeah,
challenges
yeah.
also that everyone should be aware of, is that the aerospace insurance market is small when you think about it. And it also is made up of airlines, general aviation. Those are the people that are out there in their Cessnas flying around. Aviation products, and then space, meaning third-party space liability if you do bodily injury or property damage to a third party. And then there's also asset insurance, which is you can actually insure a satellite. In all of those markets, there's only a certain number of them, and there's only certain limits that are available out there. And we're getting to a point where I'm placing passenger liability for government astronauts to go to the International Space Station. And there's only a certain limit of liability that is available out there. And what's available for, say, government astronauts may not be available for space tourists. And those are the billionaires that are going into space. So there was a recent claim that happened, the Viasat. It could be about $420 million. It's out there in the public domain. And that could be a huge hit to the aerospace liability market in general, because we won't have enough capacity. You won't be able to buy enough insurance because it's just not going to be available. And there's also, unfortunately, the Russia-Ukraine war is also creating havoc in the aerospace marketplace right now, due to the fact that there were hundreds of millions of dollars worth of leased aircraft over in Russia. And right now there's about $7 billion in claims that is out there. And the aerospace market as a whole has about $4.5 to $5 billion in premium. So if something happens at the $7 billion level, it's going to be a huge hit to the aerospace market. Now that's going to be litigated, and the first part of that is going to, I think, start taking place October of 2024. So insurance premiums are expensive in the aerospace market.
There's a catch-22 also for the launch services provider. To the extent the launch service provider decides to insure the launch system, can have a negative impact on the availability for payload insurance to customers. It's interesting.
So, this is could be daunting. Michael, can you, how does an entrepreneur handle all of this? I mean, if I were an entrepreneur, I'd be overwhelmed hearing all of this, but tell us how we manage it.
So let's say that you're shipping something from California to Virginia now, by rail or by air. You don't think today about negotiations with each of the states between California and Virginia. You don't enter into a separate negotiated agreement with each of the different rail groups that will ultimately move that car all across the country. You certainly don't negotiate any kind of new insurance agreement. You may buy insurance on your product, but it'll just be a standard policy. The point is, we all live as entrepreneurs in a fully mature environment in all of our normal platform, infrastructure, transport, and communication needs. Space is, like all regulation, catching up with innovation. And so regulation, by definition, lags innovation by somewhere between 2 and 5 years, sometimes even longer. And so what that means is, the first time a purely privately owned launch vehicle goes up into space, everybody goes, oh my, we never actually developed any legal regime for what happens if it blows up, for what happens if it blows up at any stage along the way. All of these requirements need to be developed. Some of them are legal, some of them are risk-based, like insurance, some of them are purely functional. Who's responsible for this? Who communicates with that? Who manages this? All of that work, not at the technical part of that work, but the legal part of that work, is being done by the panelists up here today and the others who are sort of the legal pioneers in the field. But the goal of all of that work is to make it dull, boring, repeatable, and certain.
Yep.
And when it is dull, boring, repeatable, and certain, then capital will begin to flow to the space in a much more uninhibited way. So, but we're not yet in the dull, boring, repeatable, and certain phase. It's still being worked out with each specific situation. And the issues of liability, because they are international in nature, are going to be thorny and complex. None of that is a surprise. None of that is going to inhibit the development towards the future, but it will be what things will look like for the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years.
And when that routine comes around, those contracts are going to be much easier to negotiate. And I have to say that some of my entrepreneurial clients get so frustrated over how much time it takes to negotiate a contract, because a lot of the issues that we're tackling are still in development. And there are long lead times in space. You've got to have a lot of patience in this industry. And boy, when that day comes when everything can be routinized, and thankfully we've got some arrows pointing in that direction, which is really wonderful. But we just have to, I guess, maintain our patience. I want to turn it over to the audience for questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. The four of us could talk all day, so we're going to try to stop doing that, at least for now, and turn it over to you guys.
Business development for the Boeing company, based out of Kennedy Space Center.
Can you speak up or a little bit closer to the mic?
Oh, is this better?
That's very good. Thank you.
No, it's a little low too. So
Yeah.
but there we go.
I don't have that problem.
As Director Jimmy King mentioned earlier, we had a big accomplishment with Artemis 1. That was huge. That was great. We got the Orion space capsule back in the vicinity of the moon, something we haven't done in a long time. One of the first steps into getting to deep space. Right. Okay. Moving forward, there are some things that need to be done. when it comes to human space travel in deep space. One of the leading, I guess, potential solutions is nuclear power production, right? So that kind of gives you the ability to really sustain some of your architectures that you have out in space for human spaceflight. First, those things have to be developed, and as we're developing these things, we're seeing that there may be some regulations that might get in the way. So from a legal perspective, what do you think, or what are some of your thoughts on what needs to be done so we can overcome some of those challenges that'll keep some of these space nuclear propulsion or space nuclear power production technologies might stop them from getting from the sketch pad to the launch pad? What are your thoughts on that?
Talk about it.
Yeah.
Do exactly what you're doing. Engage, because I know nuclear has kind of a bad, negative connotation, but you're right. It's a part of the equation. There's a place for it. We've seen it, in submarines and in other instances. So there's definitely a place for it. Keep doing things with it, engage with it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so I would say also one of the issues is insurance has an outright nuclear exclusion, which I'm sure you're aware of. So what I say to my clients is the more we can talk about this, to Kristen's point, to any underwriter, to get them and to, for lack of better words, kind of dumb it down so that the normal average human can understand what it is that it could potentially happen. In commercial launches, we have these things called maximum probable losses. I mean, can somebody tell the underwriting community, if you put this nuclear fuel on this rocket, or if it's in a satellite, what is the blast zone? How many people can we affect? How many people would be affected by it? Is it a Chernobyl experience, or is it just, something that, it could be, you could kind of mitigate it somehow. And I mean, there's a difference between it when it's launches and when it's also in orbit as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of radiation already up there in space, so.
Also leverage the government.
Mm-hmm.
Ask the government to provide protections.
Yes.
85804 does that for Department of Defense work in certain circumstances. And yeah, you can get a lot of enabling out of NASA, DoD, and others.
And my goal is to even get if you can even get a small amount of insurance, say it's only $1 million, say it's $5 million, it's something that is, a limit that is the primary limit, and then government indemnification sitting above it. I mean, I want to get insurance for people, and I have clients asking me for it, so I just talk about it and bring it to more people's attention.
I think one additional point to make about innovation in any highly regulated industry, and that's exactly what you're talking about. Individual actor engagement with policymakers is far less effective than group engagement with policymakers. So if this is an initiative that Boeing has underway, and of course there's research being done and activities being undertaken, for Boeing alone to approach policymakers in the federal government, or frankly internationally regarding treaty obligations, is less effective than for industry-wide and ultimately global industry-wide engagement on that topic. So at the end of the day, there is going to be obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and the transport of nuclear material into space and for use as a fuel source is a wonderful example of something which has been dealt with as a regulatory no-go zone and essentially completely blocked. When there are baby steps taken in order to allow it from a policy perspective, it will almost certainly be because of concerted engagement of as broad a group of stakeholders as possible with policymakers.
Thank you.
This was a really great question.
Submit your proposal to NASA tipping point opportunities.
Yeah, just one more thing, because this is such a hot topic, and we didn't even plan on you asking this question, but so glad that you did. It is a really hot topic, and it is unavoidable, because you're right, for deep space in particular, Pluto New Horizons was nuclear power source, for example. And there, by the way, there happens to be, for lawyers in the room or people who like to look at laws, check out the Price-Anderson Act. It specifically addresses third-party liability for nuclear accidents, disasters. It arose out of the terrestrial nuclear industry, but has application for space activities as well. So thank you for the great question.
No, thank you guys.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Kelly Gilkey. I'm at NASA Glenn. I'm the lead there for the Human Research Program. So you've spoken quite a bit about like the vehicles and the transport and whatnot. I'm curious what the current state is, talking about commercial crew and how they're ensuring life.
Great question. Thank you.
Great question. So, well, without getting too granular, there's the Commercial Space Launch Act, which the people are not third parties. Insurance policies are written for for legal liability for third party to bodily injury or property damage. So the insurance industry is actually writing something called passenger liability, and we're including the people in there. There is the most that we've been able to obtain is 100 million limit of liability. I don't know if that limit is sustainable going forward. Some markets only want to write 50 million, some only want to write 10. I've been able to hold them to the 100 million. I think we get into some murky waters when we start talking about on-orbit liability and government astronauts, and there being insurance limits and contracts. They're not supposed to be third parties. However, in their human capacity, they can still sue. There's a lot of nuances there. There's a lot of things that I think need to get litigated. There is insurance that's available. It's a small amount. And even if you say it's 5 million aggregate limit, which means that you only have to purchase 5 million in a contract, it doesn't mean that if, God forbid, something happens and there is a settlement that is 100 million, so say you only procured 5 million, who's paying the other 95 million? So that's going to come off your balance sheet. And another thing that is one of the challenges is that there are different entities out there that have different buying powers. Some are watching their balance sheets. Some have all the money in the world and they can do what they want with it, right? So it's an interesting challenge in the insurance industry because you have, one person is launching people up into space and he's doing a very good job of it. So, but he doesn't use insurance, so we don't know what he's doing. He has to abide by financial responsibility laws, but every day I'm on the phone trying to get insurance for people in space, and it is becoming more and more challenging, I can tell you that.
Jim, yeah, I see your hand.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. Any other questions from the audience? Anyone? Sure, right up there. Yeah, there's a microphone back over to your left, if you don't mind, for all of our online attendees.
Hello, I am Caleb Gilger. I'm a student at the University of Cincinnati, and I wanted to ask, as a member of this room and as a member of the future of aerospace engineers that are going to have to deal with this incomplete system of legal stuff to go through, what do you think is the responsibility or focus of engineers moving forward in order to get this to a point in which, as he was saying earlier, Sketchpad can become action in a more easy way? In other words, what do the engineers, the researchers, both academic, industrial, and federal, need to be focusing on with their implementation in order to sort of eliminate or minimize these gates that you have with space law?
Find people that complement your skill set, just as Michael said.
So find people that complement your skill set, but more importantly, band together. What is the fundamental national representative organization of aerospace engineers? In other words, that organization needs to become the advocacy point for this sort of change in the future. Your job as an engineer is going to be to invent the future. The organization's job is going to be to advocate for the supportive environment that will allow the future to actually come into being. So you don't want to try to do both. You know, obviously you can participate in the organization, but what it fundamentally means is there has been a view in the entrepreneurial community for many, many, many years that successful enterprise exists in areas that are not highly regulated. Let's do consumer gaming. Let's do social media websites. Let's do software of different types, etc. Turns out, A, all of those things were highly regulated after all. Who knew? And second of all, it turns out that there's a huge amount of innovation happening in sectors that we know are highly regulated: communications, transport, and then ultimately space. So you're going to be inventing that future in the space along with all the others who are coming up in the engineering community. But that means that you have to build engagement on policy into your plan from the beginning, not as a catch-up kind of event after the fact. So it's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
Again.
And engage your lawyers. I'll just speak for myself. I don't bite. I'm really nice. I know what I'm doing. Don't be afraid of your lawyers, please.
for
We really,
yourself.
really, really want to help you.
Exactly.
I think anybody else? I don't want to cut it off, but I also don't want to overstay our welcome. Great. Thanks, everybody.